Outside of a handful of cases, there really aren't that many examples of successful video games that are based on novels. The movie industry pretty much uses novels as their bread and butter, but that couldn't be more different from the way games use them.
It's just a fundamentally different kind of storytelling. One where time, space, and lighting is constant, and violence and action takes precedent over character development and plot twists. Games also need to have rules and interactivity, and maybe this is why you more often see games that are loosely based on the setting or tone of a book rather than the actual events contained within them. But that doesn't mean that games don't have their own advantages when it comes to telling stories. In fact, gaming is actually a more realistic storytelling medium than books, and that's where a lot of the challenges of game writing come from. The conventional gameplay of long-lasting action adventures is repetitive, and that prevents designers from chopping it up into little bites or presenting players with a perfectly executed plot every time. You have to follow each step of your character from room to room, dealing with a bunch of little details and movements that books are gonna gloss over for the sake of time. You're also gonna make mistakes and deal with consequences in a way that puts more personal responsibility on the audience than it does in other mediums. A lot of developers have embraced these facts, both for better and for worse. But one author, who was arguably the most successful at turning his books into games, is no longer with us.
Tom Clancy passed away last week at the age of 66, leaving behind an expansive universe of books, movies, and video games. And what's interesting is that over the years, his name has almost become more recognizable for doing video games than actual career game designers.
I'm serious, there are 51 games with the Tom Clancy name stamped on them, even though he didn't really play a big part in their development. There were game versions of Hunt for Red October and Red Storm Rising back in the 80s, but the floodgates really started to open in 1996 when Clancy founded Red Storm Entertainment, who would start out by making a few games directly based on his books. Politica and Rainbow Six were both based on novels published during the game's development cycle, which allowed Clancy himself to act as consultant and share research with the team. He held a title as chairman of Red Storm throughout the late 90s, and into the 21st century we began to see original Clancy game franchises pop up, such as Ghost Recon and Splinter Cell.
And I guess that's around the time that I started to notice a fundamental shift in what the Tom Clancy brand was supposed to represent. For most of my childhood, the Tom Clancy games were some serious shit, like hardcore, borderline simulation stuff that was not meant for the mainstream consumer. But during my adolescence and up, that's not what the name meant at all. The games got more accessible, more cinematic, and the difficulty spike certainly wasn't as high as it used to be.
The original Rainbow Six games were a far cry from your typical first-person shooter of the time. Everyone died in one hit, and you were up against a crack shot of an AI. You had to spend about a third of the game just planning out your missions rather than actually playing them, and you had to do that. Death was permanent, and the stakes were sky high. The game was unfair, and you couldn't afford to make mistakes, but you had a wide selection of tools and tactics to make it through. It was downright brutal, and I actually loved that game. Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon was more of the same gameplay but in outdoor environments, so you had even less cover. And it's important to know that back in the late 90s, this kind of game felt raw. You didn't get this level of realism from pretty much any other shooter. Most of them were just about aliens and space marines. And you know, as much praise as Half-Life got for being, quote, realistic, unquote, the Tom Clancy games made it look like a psychedelic fairy tale. But that was before Splinter Cell. In 2000, Ubisoft purchased Red Storm and acquired royalty rights to Tom Clancy's name, which let them use it for games developed outside of Red Storm. Ubisoft Montreal had just opened a few years earlier, and their headquarters back in France wanted to put them to work on a big, blockbuster AAA game project, and they knew exactly how to do it. They'd make a Tom Clancy's stealth game to compete with Metal Gear Solid.
And that is when the shift happened. Splinter Cell was a Tom Clancy game that was not serious shit. Compared to the others, it was very forgiving.
Don't get me wrong, it was way more grounded than the competition, and it was still a great game regardless. Thanks to core mechanics that worked and some really great writing and vocal performances, it did a good job of filling a new role in the stealth genre. But it lacked the overwhelming degree of realism that made the previous Clancy games so unique. Your character could survive countless gunshot wounds, and you could peek the camera over corners he wouldn't be able to see past. You'd also think that those bright green lights attached to him would have been a pretty dead giveaway. And actually, believe it or not, that was a big source of contention between Clancy and the game designers. Considering the liberties that this game takes, the actual stealth here is almost as ridiculous to look at as the stealth in Metal Gear.
But Rainbow Six was still doing its military sim thing even in 2003 when it hit its third installment in the post-Halo world. So for a while back in those days I didn't really know what the Tom Clancy brand was supposed to represent. And upon retrospect, that seems to kind of make sense. I read Patriot Games and Rainbow Six in high school, and I remember those books weirdly writing that line between being a mundane, technical military account for armchair generals, and also a rollicking action-adventure for the mass market. I remember there being like 10 pages in the intro to Patriot Games that were just devoted to describing the gun Jack Ryan gets shot with. But they also had the over-the-top heroics and the constant threat of a global disaster, and that's kind of the juggling act that his games follow up too. Actually, pretty much anything with his name stamped on it does that.
The Tom Clancy movies are traditional Hollywood blockbusters. They get the biggest actors to play out unlikely events that are driven by over-the-top heroes who have the odds stacked against them. They're really not that unconventional, even though I can barely understand what everyone's saying.
Con sonar, new contact bearing 097. Designate contact number Sierra 35.
Captain I. What do you got, Jonesy?
Distant contact, probably submerged. It's a wild guess, but I'd say we had a boomer coming out of the bar. Could be a missile boat out of Polyarny.
And a lot of his plots steer towards the kind of right-wing conservative territory that gets increasingly more questionable the further you get from the Reagan era. There was always an evil Russian pulling the strings behind the scenes, a lot of European villains who wanted to make good on the threats of the Cold War. The bad guys in Rainbow Six were actually environmentalist terrorists who wanted to wipe out the human race because pollution. His books had a better reputation for getting the little details right than they did for nailing the larger plots, but it's not like they were advertised as postmodern literary masterpieces. They were pulp fiction thrillers like Splinter Cell, and over the next few years that's also where Rainbow Six and Ghost Recon would go. The 6th-gen console versions of those two franchises would gradually streamline the planning phase out, but kept a lot of the high-tension, quick deaths and complicated squad tactics in. It was around the 7th gen, with Rainbow Six Vegas, that things got absolutely crazy, with regenerating health, a third-person cover system, and a plot that was downright cartoony. In 2008, Ubisoft bought the Tom Clancy name flat out, so with no more royalties, they can now do whatever they want with it. And as the foundational mechanics of the original games of the original franchises kept withering away, we saw entirely new franchises come and go, none of which focused on the realism and technical accuracy that made the early Clancy games so special. There's a couple of fighter jet games called Hawks that may just be the most arcadey Clancy games yet. Future Soldier and End War border on science fiction. The story and gameplay of Splinter Cell are both getting less cerebral, and the upcoming The Division looks about as realistic as a soup sandwich.
Now, this video isn't about determining if realism is good or bad, or if the games themselves are good or bad. I enjoyed the Vegas games, but in a radically different way than the other Rainbow Six games. Yet they all have the same brand, they're all Tom Clancy games. And in a Tom Clancy game, realism is employed in a very deliberate way. The reason why they're Tom Clancy games is because that's a branding effort. It's an effort to brand these games as something not necessarily smarter, but more feasible than other games. And so nowadays, with a lot of Tom Clancy games around doing things that aren't that feasible, the name just doesn't mean as much as it used to.
And maybe that's because, in a way, almost all military action games are Tom Clancy games. The popularization of quasi-realistic military shooters is arguably driving the industry's economy now, and that's a process that began 15 years ago when Clancy founded Red Storm. And Clancy himself has laid the groundwork for what kind of style and tone that any military thriller should have. Seriously, take a look at Red Storm Rising and just try to count how many games follow that plot to the T. You won't get far before finding some of the highest selling games of all time. For better or for worse, he's provided us with some of the most influential source material that makes modern action games just work. There are only two other universes that I can imagine having the same amount of influence as the Clancyverse, and they are J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and Ridley Scott's Alien.
And it's kinda sad that games owe so much to people who aren't professional game makers, but Tom Clancy's contributions went beyond mere inspiration. They were a deliberate push from the man himself to bring gaming something that it lacked, to give it a hard dose of reality.
And maybe that's why Rainbow Six is just one of a handful of cases where basing a game off a novel really works. The game just embraces his commitment to nailing the little details. It makes the most out of all your small, room-by-room movements. Time is precious and so are your consequences. Team deaths are permanent, the story continues without its characters, and the silliness of the overall plot can be ignored, because the heat of the moment is what really matters. And back in the day when the hardest games out there were about dodging space lasers, that felt really refreshing. So what was Tom Clancy's contribution to gaming? It was the entire ethos of almost all the military action games we see today.